Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is entitle, and this verb was suggested by the viewer Hassan Mohammed. Hassan Mohammed, thank you so much for the suggestion. Now let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or ways that we can use this verb. The first way you might encounter the verb entitle means to give someone a legal right or a just claim to either receive something or to do something. With this first definition, I'm going to ask you to think about a situation where maybe you've seen a coupon or received some type of special offer. And on that document, it says, this entitles the beholder to maybe one free something or so many minutes of free activity, if it happens to be like an entertainment facility. That's exactly what this first definition is talking about, giving someone the right or the claim to something. A second way you might encounter the verb entitle means to give something, especially a text or work of art, a particular title. So really, this is the action of naming a piece of writing or a piece of art. For now, you should know that entitle is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, we're going to drop the E on the end before we add ing. That forms entitling. The past tense and the participle form of our verb can be made by just adding the verb or the letter D because our word already ends in an E. Now the base verb entitle ends in a voiced L sound. This means our ed ending is just going to make a D sound. We're not going to make or add an extra syllable to the verb when we say it. The past tense and the participle form of the verb should sound like this: entitled, entitled. Now, we don't have any phrasal verbs that we need to study, but before we move on to our verb tense practice, I'd like to do a little review of active versus passive voice. Whenever I'm making these videos, I do try and think about, okay, how are people going to either hear this verb used or how will they see it? And as I looked for real-world examples, I saw a number of them using the passive voice. So that's why I've chosen to review that today. So most of the time in my videos, I talk about making sentences in the active voice. You're probably used to me starting verb tense practice with, we're going to start with our subject. That's the person or the thing that's responsible for the action. I've got two example sentences here that could help illustrate that. Tim cleaned the house yesterday. Leslie wrote notes. In the first sentence, I know Tim is responsible for the action of cleaning. In the second, I know Leslie is responsible for the action of writing. But sometimes you will notice people writing sentences or speaking in what's called passive voice. In passive voice, our sentence is going to begin with the person or the thing that is acted on. Sometimes we call this the object. It's the thing that's receiving the action of the sentence. The person who's responsible for the action may be included in the sentences, and if that's the case, it's going to come at the end followed by the preposition by, but many times they are excluded from the sentence. So if I take my first example, Tim cleaned the house, and I change it to passive voice, I could say, the house was cleaned. And I could put a period there, or I could say, the house was cleaned by Tim. Both of those would be acceptable. In the second example, Leslie wrote notes. If we want to make that passive voice, we would just say, notes were written, period, or notes were written by Leslie, period. So many people then, after I talk about this in my classes or with students, they want to know, why do we have this? Because we really just double the number of ways that we can make sentences, because all verb tenses in English could either be an active voice or passive voice. Well, people use passive voice for a number of different reasons. Sometimes it's because we don't know who to give credit for that person or thing that's responsible for an action, right? So we kind of avoid assigning responsibility. A second reason that some people will do it is because the person who is doing the action, or that's responsible for the action, it just isn't important, right? And it sort of connects to the third reason, and that's that sometimes writers or speakers really want to emphasize the object. So they want their readers or their listeners to sort of pay attention to that person or thing that is acted on. And so by moving that to the beginning of the sentence, it might sort of stick with that reader or listener a little bit better. A fourth situation, which brings some people to using passive voice, is when they do not want to blame another person, right? So they might say, mistakes were made, instead of saying, Tim made a mistake or Leslie made a mistake. So now, with this in mind, we're going to do a little practice in the simple past tense today. We're going to focus on our verb entitle, and we're going to compare the active voice to the passive voice. Okay, let's start with our affirmative or positive way of making a sentence, and we'll start with the active voice. Our structure here is going to be to start with our subject and then use that ed form of the verb. So an example of this might be, the author entitled his last book, Going Infinite, the Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon. This sentence would go back to that second definition here. We're talking about a text and the naming of a text. This sentence specifically is using the writer Michael Lewis as an example. That is a real book. Okay, so in that sentence, we know who's responsible, even though I was a little more general with that subject, the author. Okay, now if I want to make a sentence, again, still affirmative, but in the passive voice, I might say, his last book was entitled Going Infinite, the Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon. So now our emphasis, our attention is being placed on the object, what received the action of naming the text, and that's the new book. Now let's look at making negative active voice sentences. To do this in the simple past tense, we start with our subject, we use did, not, and then the base verb. Notice I'm not going to use the ed form of my verb. Here's another example. The city argued that the union contract didn't entitle Jones to both double pay and time off for overtime hours. Okay, so here we're going back to our first definition, talking about having a legal right to something, and here it's that double pay and time off accrual, it sounds like, in this dispute between a union and a city as an employer. Now, if I want to make that sentence passive voice, again, I start with my object. I'm going to use our past form of be here, followed by not, and then I use the participle form of the verb. So you will see that ed ending in the passive voice. Here's another example. The city argued Jones wasn't entitled to both double pay and time off for overtime hours. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple past tense, first in the active voice. To do this, we start with did, then we'll have our subject, and then the base verb. No ed here in the active voice. So, an example of this. Did the coupon entitle you to a free ice cream cone? Okay. But if we were going to do that same idea, when I convey that same message in the passive voice, again, I start with a past form of be, So we have was and we have were, so we've got to watch what comes next because we want to match our tense there, our agreement. That's the word I'm looking for. But we will use that ed ending in the passive voice for. So last example, were you entitled to a free ice cream cone? So here, we don't know maybe why or what's giving us the right to that thing. We're really just more focused on kind of the, did you get the free one? Now, let's move on and spend a little time talking about some words that are related to our verb entitle. And the first word we'll discuss is the noun form of this word. The noun form is entitlement. And this word as a noun can have a number of different meanings. We're going to talk about 4 of them. The first way to use it is to refer to the fact of having a right to something. An example of this might be, we will pursue the entitlement to fees and maintenance. As I looked for examples, again, of this, I saw some wording very similar to this in attorneys' statements about certain matters or certain cases, sort of suggesting like we have the right to seek the other side paying our court costs and attorneys' fees. But a second way to use that noun entitlement is to refer to the amount which a person has a right. So here we're sort of thinking like, what is owed to someone? So an example of this might be, the company has an annual leave entitlement of 160 hours for new employees. So 160 hours is the amount of maybe this is vacation or paid time off that a person has a right to at this organization. A third way to use the noun entitlement is to refer to the belief that one or maybe a group of people is inherently deserving of privileges or maybe some special treatment. An example of this, they navigate the world with such an air of entitlement, right? We might be describing people who don't seem like they should have to wait in lines like most average human beings, or they think they are owed something else or need to be treated in a superior way in other regards. That's what's meant by that third definition. Now, a fourth way you might encounter the noun entitlement is to refer to some form of a government program that provides benefits to an individual who meets certain eligibility requirements. So here in the United States, our Social Security program and Medicare would be another example, are oftentimes described as entitlements. And so there are many different rules around how you become eligible for or are able to receive these benefits. That goes way beyond the scope of this, but I was starting to explain this because of my example sentence here. It says, she resents Social Security being labeled as an entitlement because she has contributed to it her entire working life. And that's how the system works. Every person who works a job receives wages or salary. A portion of their income goes into Social Security. And also the employer also pays into this fund. And then once you reach a certain age, you start to get monthly payments. So some people feel a little salty when other people kind of talk down about this or call it an entitlement, because I think it connects back to the third definition, where like someone deserves something or deserves something special, and they're going like, no, I'm not special. I just did what I was supposed to. I worked, I contributed, now I should receive the benefits that were promised. So one more word for us today, and we're going to talk about the adjective entitled, you'll notice this looks exactly like our past tense and participle form of the verb, same pronunciation. But when this word gets used as an adjective, it's generally describing someone who has a belief that that individual is inherently more deserving of privileges or special treatment. So, an example of this, I heard a coach say this recently: no one on our team is entitled. And so what they were trying to say is everybody's contributing, everyone's working hard. The idea that like maybe I don't have to do this because I'm better than this other group, that's not occurring. Once again, I want to say a special thanks to Hassan Mohammed for suggesting today's verb. I thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.